Welcome back, amazing, beautiful people, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Today, we've got on our third repeat guest, Isabel Brown. And I just have to thank you for all of the support that you've provided the show, because when we first had on Isabel, that was episode 4, and now we're at episode 42, which is insane. Thank you for all the support you've provided. Isabel's coming on the show because recently we had on my friend Victor Shi on, who's a young person who leads and influences a lot on the Democratic side, is a big supporter of President Biden. Meanwhile, Isabel is a conservative influencer online who's absolutely grown her brand from when we first had her 300,000 followers to 800,000 plus now. This conversation was really fascinating because I wanted to ask her two things. The first focus of this conversation was, how have the consumption habits of young people changed the incentive structures of how media is produced? In other words, it seems like young people these days are more skeptical of establishment, quote unquote, sources of information like CNN, like mainstream media, and instead are more interested in decentralized media like podcasts, live streams, listening to influencers as opposed to qualified news anchors. Why is that? Isabel has been at the forefront, I think, of leading this transformation in the way that media is consumed. And so I thought, who better to have on than Isabel to actually talk about that trend? And the second reason is that Isabel's actually releasing a book on March 19th, which was, I think, last week, depending on when the show goes live. And admittedly, this one we're pre-recording because I wanted to figure out some of the information flows that are happening in our conversation and match this episode with that, because I think that it makes it more relevant to where we are. And Isabel's book is called The End of the Alphabet: How Gen Z Can Save America. Now, you can imagine, save America. What do we mean by that, Manu? Well, that's the second part of this conversation. The first part, we talk about media and how that's changing. And the second part is, what does it actually mean to save America from Isabel's standpoint? And specifically, this is what you'll love, as the show's called The Hopeful Majority. And for all the new people joining, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we produce this show. And the reason for the show is how to have nuanced conversations across lines of difference. The second part of Isabel's conversation is all about nuance. It's all about how we remove the right from conservative and the left from liberal. What does it mean to actually have a marketplace of debate and discussion and dialogue where we can actually see each other, understand each other's common humanity? How do we build a world in which young people can actually transform and make it interesting and actually in some ways countercultural to be nuanced rather than to be part of our tribal echo chambers? Isabel is probably one of the most fastest growing influencers right now in the country. And yes, her ideas may fall on one side of the aisle, and yet she's somebody that I think brings the temperament to think about these issues in a productive and interesting way. And ultimately, that's what the show is about. The show is about bringing on folks that have really strong ideas, have really strong beliefs, because the problem is not what we believe, it's how we believe. So bring on people with strong ideas, strong beliefs, and a temperament that I call the bridging mindset. The temperament that revolves around this hopeful majority. And if you're new to the show, the reason why I'd love for you to keep listening, keep joining, is because I think that there are more people like us, like you and I, that want to live in a world where we have ideas, where we have different beliefs, and yet we can have the discussion, where we come from different parts of the country, where we come from different backgrounds, and yet we can see each other's common humanity, where we believe in empathizing with new perspectives, where we believe in giving people a chance to speak up, where we believe not necessarily in pushing people out, but giving people the chance to be better. And that's what the show's about. That's what this conversation's about. I really appreciated this conversation because, boy, it spanned a whole host of topics. And remember, Isabel was also on an episode 4 of this show. So if you're new, go back to that. That title is America, the Most Ambitious Experiment. I'm so excited. Let's hear Isabel. Hey, Isabel, welcome back to the podcast.
I am so happy to be here, Manu. We were just catching up for the first time in way too many months. So we owe each other more calls in between these podcast episodes. But so cool to see the growth that you've been able to have the last couple of months with Bridge, with the pod, and everything that you're working on.
Yeah, what I was just going to tell you was, people that are not watching this, but they're listening to this, if you go on YouTube and you see the comparison in our backgrounds, I look like I'm in a hostage scenario with an all white background wall. Because I'm right now traveling and I'm with my family in Boston, and you have like your actual setup. And so it looks like one of us is being held actively under threat.
Yeah, it's all right though. It's so funny when I go home and I visit my parents' house in Colorado. They try so hard and they're so sweet when I have to do a news hit or I'm doing my live
Sure.
stream from there and they try to set up this adorable background or something and it's just never the same when you're on the road. But what I love about content in our generation, it doesn't matter if you look like you've been homeless for 6 months or you look like you're in a multi-million
Yeah.
dollar studio, it all has the same capacity to be great content.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think our generation is built in that way?
I think it mostly centers around authenticity. And I mean, obviously I have this beautiful setup, but like this is the spare bedroom of my apartment. I'm sitting
Sure.
here after 12 hours of filming podcasts and interviews and stuff. I probably look like it actually because I'm exhausted. But I think people love watching videos where you're taking your makeup off after a long day or you're crying in the car after you got in a fight with your boyfriend and you look disheveled and you feel disheveled because for so long internet culture really
Mhm.
circulated around being hyper edited and curated and perfect and this unattainable lifestyle, especially in the era of like traditional Instagram influencers from
Oh, yeah.
2010 to 2020. And really in 2020, this whole can of worms opened with TikTok and the rise of TikTok that what we crave from content is getting to know the person on the screen
Mm.
far more than this image that they're trying to sell us. And that authenticity piece just really shines through. You can tell if somebody's trying to sell you on something, you scroll right past it and you think this isn't real. This is definitely some sort of version of themselves that they're trying to put on the internet. But when you're getting what you see, that is so uncomparable with the internet.
Yeah, I mean, I literally just posted on Instagram my story of what this setup looks like currently, and this tube light is hung up by a string that's attached to the wall, and then the podcast microphone is propped up on
Oh
the
yeah.
Shure phone. So I feel you on that. Well, okay, let me ask you this. So you talk about how media is disaggregated. You talk about how you're recording this in your spare bedroom of your apartment. That with
That's a
Gen Z,
mess, by the way. There's stuff all over the floor, but you wouldn't see it. So there you go.
so you've got and the open admission that like we're trying to figure it out. It seems like there's a shift in sort of this greater skepticism that young people have towards institutions. It seems like, people would much rather watch this than watch, a CNN news clip or a Fox news clip. Why do you think that shift is happening? And do you see that shift happening across the board, especially like as you've built your platform? Is that something that you're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because where we started to see distrust in public
Hmm.
institutions come to fruition, really centering around COVID, I would argue, to the mass level that we've seen it in society, it really only popped up in a few areas of culture. We saw that for higher education because we all realized,
Mm.
we're paying, $500,000 this year to do what? To sit here on Zoom for something that I could YouTube in half the time and learn a whole lot more. And obviously, you saw that in public health institutions as well. And I don't know that either has bounced back, but you're right. Rather has really permeated other areas of American culture. I was
Mhm.
commenting on this morning to my fiance, but I was scrolling through social media this week and just saw post after post after post after post about the Oscars, and everybody just
Mm.
kept trying to sell me on watch the Oscars, do the Oscars, this outfit at the Oscars, everything. And I just thought, why are they pushing this so hard? Probably because they have record low viewership. There's distrust in what's happening in Hollywood, and I wouldn't even say distrust necessarily, but disinterest in
Mm.
engaging with something that is so hyper edited, curated, and messaged to be marketed to you to try to sell you on something, be it a
Mm.
multi-million dollar movie out of Hollywood or a Fox News segment or CNN or MSNBC news segment that clearly is trying to say we're unbiased journalism, but is actually trying to sell you on an objective and a point of view. And so I think when you look at everything across the board, be it education, be it the clothes that we're wearing in the fashion industry, the food that we're eating every day, social media feeds, mainstream media, whatever that might look like, maybe there is a level of distrust, but I think it's evolving into this. We want something much
Mm.
more authentic
Mhm.
and real perspective
Mhm.
that is so valuable and allowing people to take stock in what type of information we share and engage with every day.
Yeah, so I asked you this right before jumping on, but you know I'm a fan when I followed your growth since you first came on the show. And you're, by the way, the third repeat guest. Last week, the 2 episodes beforehand, we actually had one of my friends, Victor Shi, who's
Love
very much in
Victor.
it.
I'm on the news with him all the time. He's great.
Yep. So yeah, and he's as you know on the other side of the political aisle from you, but he has a really interesting perspective. And so I had both. I actually wanted to bring both of you on around sort of a similar time so that folks get different perspectives on issues that are happening. And when you first came on the show, which is episode 4, and the title of that for anybody listening is America, the Most Ambitious Experiment.
Hmm.
So around then, you had about like 270, 300,000 followers. I try to like be really focused and not creepy, but focused on like, who am I talking to, right? And since then, so it's now been 7-ish months, you're now at like 830,000. And you just talked about authentic media. You talked about the fact that like young people are just focused on just getting information, but they don't want it to be sold to them.
Yeah.
What do you think explains your success, or doesn't explain your success in those last 7 months? And do you think that that tracks sort of broader just trends in how young people are actually consuming the information?
Well, I'll start by saying I have absolutely no idea what has happened this last year and a half or so. I feel incredibly blessed, and it is far beyond my wildest dreams what we could have possibly achieved with all of the communities that we've been growing authentically. I've never put a single dime behind any of my accounts in terms of boosting content or advertising it. It's always been this intentional organic growth that we want this to be what you see is what you get, real people having real conversations every day. And I went fully independent with my content about a year ago exactly when I moved to Florida. So there was no company involvement in any of the things that I was posting. I occasionally do some contract work for a couple of different organizations, and you'll know because I collab with them on my account. But really, every single thing, with very few exceptions, that we put out every day is I wake up in the morning, I scroll through social media for a little while, we see what's going on in the world, we record a couple of videos and do a live stream about it, and we go to bed and do it all the next day. And the growth
just really
Go
quickly,
ahead,
let
go
me
ahead.
just ask you. Let me just ask you on that. Like, how big is what does your operation look like? Like, take us behind the scenes of what the day to day looks like on a show like yours that has grown significantly, as compared to a highly produced CNN
Yeah.
segment that takes millions of dollars. Like, just take the viewers into that.
Or
For a second.
even beyond mainstream media, I think you look at a lot of these right of center, more on traditional news networks or media companies like a Daily
Uh-huh.
Wire, for example. Those shows typically involve teams of several dozen people working on every single show. I used to appear on Candace Owens' podcast, for example, once a month with her panel that she used to do on the show long before they restructured it. But even then, there was like 85 people working on Candace's show at the Daily Wire. People for your makeup, and people for your clothes, and people in sound, and people in editing, and people running on and off set to make sure everything looked okay and was set up okay. And it's a huge operation. And I've always really worked in that world until pretty recently when I decided really intentionally to go independent with everything. And that was a very intentional choice for several different reasons. I guess the main reason being I've really come into the world of content creation from the political perspective. And you know me, Manu, and you too. We love politics, right? We can talk about politics all day, every day over a great cup of coffee. Who's running for president? What's Congress debating about? This week, it's banning TikTok. So we'll see how that
And we'll
goes in
get
the
there on
next
the show
couple of
too.
days.
Don't worry. I'm gonna get my fix out, and we're gonna talk about politics.
But I noticed that's not the norm for people our age. And I think we're just so exhausted being constantly surrounded by hyper partisanship with everything in our life, down to the brand of toothbrush that you used this morning. Or if you're wearing Calvin Klein underwear, you're making a blanket partisan political statement today. And when that's constantly around you all the time, there's just no room to explore new ideas because we've rehashed every single conversation possible. And I noticed all these people mostly working for conservative media in the conservative movement or conservative Inc., whatever you want to call it, basically having the same show with the same guests talking about the same thing every single day. And there really wasn't a funnel of opportunity for conversation to capture people where they're at and then try to find some common ground. I called it the cylinder or the tube. Like everybody just went in a circle having the same show with the same guests talking about the same subject on their show that day. So I really intentionally restructured things about a year and a half ago, but especially going independent last March in 2023. that I didn't really want to talk about politics all the time anymore. That was hard for me. That was a big change. But I wanted to talk about stuff like dating or the food that we eat or exercise and health or the environment or some crazy stupid TikTok trend that millions of people are talking about. This week we talked about the Kate Middleton conspiracy theory, for example. And that was fun because everybody likes to be a little lighthearted about that stuff sometimes. And of course, we'll talk about politics too, sprinkled in.
Yeah.
But I think that combined with being a team of one with a setup that's a desk in my spare bedroom of my apartment, literally happening in real time. There's no editing on my live stream show because it's happening as you're watching it. So I have no teleprompter. I have no pre-written talking points. We just figure this stuff out together in the moment. And we talk about it back and forth in the live chat. That's all been such an intentional decision to basically feel like you're hanging out in your living room with your buddy that you're talking to about whatever the heck's going on in the world and things that impact every one of us on our day-to-day lives. Obviously, I think that's contributed significantly to the growth that I've experienced because I try really hard to just be me and not have some agenda behind what I'm posting or post what somebody else wants me to say. I go research stories that I think are really interesting that I'm passionate about every day, and we make little videos or a live stream about it. And I try to make that feel like hanging out with your best friend. Now, does that explain the level of growth that I've had? No, that's completely inexplainable. But
No, but
think
I
I'm
actually think in
happy.
some ways, it does, because I think that what you're talking about that sounds relatively easy is actually very hard to do. I mean, even right now, as I'm asking these questions, you fight the impulse to replicate other podcast guests or hosts. You fight the instinct to be like something else. And I think that's what you're talking about actually is very much contrary to human nature, I think, because I think right now you're at this moment where like we have to be in our tribes, we have to be in our groups. What the other three influencers that are in my space are doing will dictate how I cover. And so
Yeah,
actually I think in
totally.
some ways, like what you're talking about is very difficult. In fact, I think in some ways it's more difficult than regurgitating certain talking points or being in that cylinder of, let's say, an environment like the Daily Wire. So like naturally then what I think about is, are you afraid of messing up in front of such a big audience? Like the fact that your live stream is unedited, right? The fact that you go on any show that basically asks you, and I know that for a fact because I asked you when we didn't like have a show. Are you not afraid of messing up, and how do you handle that?
I think I used to be early on in my creator journey. I mean, especially when you're starting out and you have the 500 people that followed you from high school and college as your audience and you're trying to grow and you don't want to lose
That's
any of
me.
those people.
That's me.
It's hard, right? I mean, it's definitely something you think about and you think, okay, there's this really controversial thing that everybody's talking about. It could get me a lot of views and a lot of clicks, but I also might lose my entire audience if I say
Mm,
something that they don't agree with. I think there's a really big temptation to be afraid of stuff like that. But what I've loved about this last year or so is we don't shy away from controversial things in any of my content in any of my communities. I mean, we've weighed in on what's happening in the Middle East right now. We're talking
sure.
about lab grown food. We talk about gender and what's happening in reproductive health. I mean, very, very controversial topics that I think it's easy for people to walk away from. But instead
Mhm.
of the fear of losing those people, I've really noticed a joy in opportunity to start conversations that people ordinarily would never have access to. And I love
Mm,
that about live streaming because in a stream, you actually have a live chat, which is what is supposed to be happening on live television, but they wouldn't interact with people, right? It's typically what you would expect from the podcast world, but those are all pre recorded for the most part. And
mhm.
so you don't have a chance to interact with the host. But I can say, you know what? I don't really know what I think about this issue. Chat, why don't you weigh in on any episode of my live stream? And tons of people will comment and we'll go back and forth. And some people might say, I can't believe you said that. But then I say, hang on, let's just play devil's advocate for a minute. And the same thing happens in comment sections for 15-second videos on TikTok. It's such a beautiful renaissance of curiosity that I'm seeing with Gen Zers and how we consume media
Mm,
right now. And maybe it does stem from that public distrust in so many different areas of American culture today. But it's opening this avenue for independent thought again. And I say independent both with a little I and a capital I. I talk about that a lot in my book. That's really inspiring me and getting me fired up again about being curious myself, admitting I don't know everything about everything. It's okay if I change my mind on something. I don't need to be afraid of that. And it's also okay if I admit I'm not an expert on this topic, but I really want to learn more and I can
mm.
learn from my audience just as much as they can from me.
So when you think about building this content, this is, I think, where the part of this conversation goes more into some of the thorny questions, because now you're the person with 832,000 followers, right? And
Yep.
now, obviously, as somebody that has also built an organization, you never want to think of yourself as having arrived. And yet, somebody listening to this that might have heard of you, it's probably like, Manu, you got to ask Isabel. Now that she in some ways is an authority on the way that social media has grown and the way that people have thought about a lot of these issues, like, how do you prevent ideological capture of your content? How do you think about what to cover? And then importantly, how do you avoid the temptation of what I see as the outrage industrial complex? This notion that the way in which you talk about things, the way in which you cover things, in some ways actually drives your growth. Like, how do you
Yeah.
avoid that trap? Or in
I
some ways, maybe fall into the
love
trap.
that.
Yeah.
What did you just say? The outrage industrial complex? I
The
love
outrage
that,
industrial
the way that you
complex.
phrased that. There's a podcaster who I've really, really enjoyed lately named Chris Williamson. His podcast is called
Sure.
Chris Willix, and he's a fascinating social commentator on everything that's going on and very fiercely independent in how he approaches issues. But he just did a little swipe through graphic about this on Instagram with this manufactured concept of outrage and how the news cycle works in America today. Let's say somebody with 2 followers posts a video about peeing in a litter box at school in Oklahoma or something, which is crazy. And it does happen, but it's extremely rare. All of a sudden, a major commentator with millions of followers and so many subscribers picks up this video and reacts to it, and it gets 20 million views across platforms. And everybody's talking about how outrageous this is and how these people in culture are poisoning everyone's mind. And this is a societal level issue. And then the other side feels the need to double down on this, and they'll say, yeah, we do stand for this. We are behind
Mhm.
this, even though one person was doing it. It was not culturally normal at all. And then the cycle keeps repeating. And I certainly find myself participating in that to some degree. And I think that's the temptation as a creator, especially when you're a commentator, more than
Mhm.
saying, come with me on this trip or get ready with me to go on a date tonight. It's easy to go for the low hanging fruit, but I always try really hard. If I'm reacting to a video that is of that nature, I'm providing something of substance in my commentary or reaction to it. Like, for example, people will find the most outrageous like identity pronoun videos, and everybody will say, this is just stupid. This is just crazy. This person's an idiot. And they call them horrible names. I always try to provide a different perspective of, I see this person that's upset about something in their life, and they're clearly trying to explain where something has gone wrong before. And instead of attacking that person, I want to attack the culture that prevents an opportunity for us to even have a dialogue about it. Because what I'm seeing is a broken person that is desperately asking for help. They just don't know how. And they post this video on the internet, and then everybody attacks them for it instead of saying, you know what, you're a human being. I can see
Mm.
myself in you. Let's bond on our shared humanity and figure out how to go forward from there. So, yeah, it is tempting to participate in the outrage industrial complex, but I try really intentionally to avoid just reacting to a video for the sake of clicks and likes. And we go about our content planning. I say we, me. I go about our
Mhm.
content planning with everything that we post pretty intentionally, not to just constantly harp on a single issue. And
Hmm.
so we'll talk about everything in our communities on the stream from, hey, this country just okayed lab grown chicken. Let's talk about chicken, and from a nutritional perspective, why this is interesting, from a scientific development perspective, why this might be interesting with innovation, and also from an ethics position, why this might be interesting. There was a woman in Europe who announced this week she's going to be the first person to marry this summer an AI hologram husband. And we reacted to that video, and I said, oh my gosh, this is like giving Blade Runner 2049. This is so crazy. I can't believe something like this exists. And then the next day we interviewed Danica Patrick about professional race car driving. And so it's just all over the place. And I think that helps to space out the outrage industrial complex, because you're not constantly harping on a single issue. A lot of other conservatives would often do.
How do you stay? And you mentioned Chris's podcast, and one of the questions he'd actually asked his guest, which is something I want to ask you, is he asked them how they stay motivated to constantly be commentating on issues, and how do you
Oof.
deal with the pressure of always having to comment on issues, especially when they come up, or there's an issue that your followers are like, react to this. What do you think? What do you think? How do you deal with that? Where do you find the motivation to always know that, okay, I've got to say something about this?
Short answer, I don't.
Hmm.
I used to, and I think the politics world is so intense that way that when you're constantly talking about extremely divisive issues, great example of this is every time a mass shooting happens, everybody from any argument on the gun control spectrum immediately has to say something. Like, this
And they have to do it
person
as quick as possible too,
literally
beat
to
the
be the
algorithm.
first person to say something. And it's always driven me insane because we don't know 99% of what's going on in this story. We will in a few days, but we don't have to be the first person to comment on everything. And I think that type of reactionism has definitely seeped into other areas of politics and culture alike. But when I became really frustrated as a consumer of that type of commentary, especially related to mass shootings and gun control tragedies and all of that, I decided years ago, I don't need to be the first person to say something about this, or I don't even need to say something about this because I'm not contributing anything unique to the conversation. There are literally thousands of other people already posting about this in the first 5 minutes. I'm just going to wait it out a few days and see if it warrants a great comment, if it warrants me saying something. If it does, what do I need to say in order to be cognizant of the situation? And if not, that's okay. You don't need to comment on every single thing. It kind of embraces the same humility of admitting you don't know everything. It takes a lot of courage, frankly, as a creator to look into the camera and say to your audience, I don't know. Those 3 words are so much harder to say than, yeah, well, I did some research, meaning I scrolled through TikTok for 6 hours about this topic, and now I know more than PhD level biologists. No, you don't actually, but it's okay to just say, I'm a person too. I'm learning in the process. And I don't have to be a voice in everything. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And sometimes I just need to listen and learn.
I don't know everything. I think that is such a powerful way to think about the way that our consumer culture is evolving, the pressure on commentators, this complex that drives quick reactionary content. And the book that you have coming out, which, by the way, is actually when you texted me, I'd learned about this book. I think it was like when you had first come on the show, because that's when the cover art had been produced and you talked about it already. But now it's coming out. What is it? March 19th, right?
Whoop, whoop.
And
Yes,
and
indeed.
March 19th, D-Day, Z-Day, and you'll find out why I'm calling it Z-Day, is because the title of the book is The End of the Alphabet: How Gen Z Can Save America. And now people are just saying, Manu, you spent like the first 15 minutes talking about why you should be authentic. Why are you now suddenly like bringing up Isabel's book? But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because you said, how can we save America? And right now you just talked about this incentive structure that we've built up where you always feel the need to drive content, drive ideas, drive growth to get somewhere. And in some ways, you actually lose the damn conversation in the process. So to me, when I hear saving America, a big part of that is like, how do we reverse the incentive structures of consumption so that it's not let me be the fastest to make a take on this so I get the most likes, but instead it is let me actually, to your point, do the research, understand what the news is, and actually say it for the purpose of informing as opposed to getting clicks. How do you go about trying to challenge that in some ways?
Challenging the incentive structure or changing it entirely, I think perfectly sums up the content of the book. And you haven't even read it yet, so well done. But I really wrote this book for 2 different reasons. Number one, there's not a lot of in our own generation self-encouragement happening right now in either American culture or politics. Really, what's happening politically is people look at Gen Z as their token to victory and say, your voice matters, your vote matters. We want you to be the forefront poster child of everything we do. But then the minute an actual Gen Zer runs for office, like we saw in 2022, my friend Caroline Levitt ran for office to be the youngest person elected to Congress in New Hampshire. And we saw Maxwell Frost actually become the youngest person ever elected to Congress here in Florida, where I live now. Interestingly, both the RNC and the DNC actively campaigned against those people because they said they were too young, they were too inexperienced, and they were taking away resources from people who just knew better how to govern the country. So I was frustrated seeing that it's really always older people who are telling us we're either too stupid and too uneducated and not experienced enough to lead, which I think we mostly see on the right, or the left is like artificially propping up Gen Z as the poster child of everything, but they don't actually want us to have a seat at the table. So first and foremost, the purpose of my book, The End of the Alphabet, is to rally our generation to stand up and to stop waiting for permission from those older than us to lead. We can talk more about that later. But the second reason that I really wrote this is because I have been exhausted, so frustrated, like at my wit's end for the last several years, being the token Gen Zer on CNN and Fox News and all of the outlets, radio, print media, constantly having to correct people older than us about who Gen Z is, because everybody has built this archetype and preconceived notion of our generation's values, our political opinions, what we care about culturally, where we're going in America, what we even want to fight for. And particularly on the right, there's been this notion that Gen Z is stupid and entitled and uneducated, which is ridiculous. We're the most educated generation in history, and we have all the information in the history of the universe available at one tap in our pocket, literally 24/7. There's this idea that we're overwhelmingly socialistic or extremely authoritarian leftist, which is not true. If you study 5 seconds of any voter exit polls or how Gen Z is trending culturally, that's just objectively not the reality. I would argue we're much more politically independent and culturally pretty conservative compared to what you think is going on in your head. And I think there's just been this huge campaign to silence and write off Gen Z as an afterthought, when in reality, the issues that are happening in Washington and beyond around the world today are going to fall on our shoulders way sooner than most people realize. And so unintentionally, the secondary audience would be people older than us trying to educate us on who Gen Z actually is.
Do you think that Gen Z, because of our information consumption habits, because of the fact that we have information at our fingertips all the time, which in some ways I don't actually know is a good thing, but putting that aside for a second, do you think that that makes us more likely to shape our habits in a way that is to challenge the incentive structures of reactionary commentary? Or do you think that our generation is one in which it is so focused on that short attention span of constant quick hit media that in fact it'll actually drive the incentive structures continuously in the negative direction?
Is it bad if I say both? I think both. I think it's fascinating as a creator because every day I make short form content and I do long form content. I'll put a 15-second video to a minute video out a few times a day, and I'll do an hour to 3 hour live stream every single day. And both have different engagement, but both serve different purposes entirely. Look at our TV, for example. TV used to be more short form when we were growing up. You'd watch a 20-minute episode on Disney Channel with commercial breaks, by the way.
Yeah.
And now we binge 10 episodes of a season the day that it drops all night long so that we can consume all of it in one fell swoop. So I think both is happening. But I like what you said there about Gen Z challenging incentive structures, because I think the truth is we're not reinventing the wheel necessarily. Historically, every young generation has repeated the exact same pattern of behavior. And it's how can we rebel? How can we challenge the norms of the people who came right before us? In American history, particularly in our grandparents' and parents' lifetimes, being punk rock and countercultural looked like sticking it to the man and metal punk rock bands and spiky hair and covering your body in tattoos. But today, rebelling against what generally is considered culturally the norm in culture, it looks very traditional. And to many, it looks very conservative. And when I say conservative, I don't mean with a capital C. Ignore the political connotation to that word.
And we'll
but
get
things
there
like
too. Yeah.
getting married and having a lot of kids and going to church and growing your own food and moving to smaller communities instead of urban areas, consuming real people's voices instead of mainstream legacy media, wherever that media falls in the political spectrum, looking for more competition in entrepreneurship. 62% of us have started our own businesses and have already done that or are in the process of doing that.
62%?
62% instead of being an intern or an unpaid college worker for some insane rich billionaire CEO in San Francisco or New York City. We're starting out as CEO on day one, which is so cool to me. And so we aren't reinventing the wheel, but we're kind of breaking the wheel of what we've been told by people who came before us is our guaranteed pathway to success and is the cultural norm. We're rejecting that in some very exciting ways right now.
I think what's interesting about the rejection is that in some ways that rejection actually drives authentic consumption. I think that the positive effect that our generation might have on the incentive structures is that we're much more likely to reward people that are producing content for the goal of information and actual genuine truth telling, and less likely to reward the shows that are just, I'm going to say this to get the clicks. I think we see through that because I think we were digitally native. But the negative side of this that I see, and I got to tell you, my friends make fun of me, Isabel, that they think I'm a boomer. And I am a boomer in some ways at heart. I mean, I have a typewriter. I spend more of my time reading like philosophical texts from the 18th century. It's really bad. And one of the things that comes up to me is that I feel like our attention span in some ways is really driving negative content consumption.
Mhm.
But what do you think about our attention span? How do you think about how that plays into where we are and how that consumption takes place?
Well, they say on average, the attention span for a Gen Zer is about 7 seconds long. And I used to think that was asinine. How could that even remotely be possible? The more I do some honest, deep digging and self assessment in my own life, yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense. If I'm sitting there scrolling, doom scrolling, as the kids say now, through TikTok or Instagram for hours and hours and hours, I'll probably spend, I'd be curious to look up the actual analytics on this
Mhm.
actually, but I'll probably spend max 20 seconds on a video and then I lose interest and I keep going. And that's if you hooked me at the very beginning and then you lose me 20, 30 seconds in, which is
Mhm.
kind of a deep self reflection
Yeah,
moment
it's
to notice, hey, even I'm a problem with this and I'm not just consuming, I'm also
dude,
creating.
it's
So how
it's
can
the
I be
epitome
intentional?
it's the epitome of window shopping done
Yes,
right. It's like what is in that window, but now on your screen is what will guide you to whether or not you stay on this clip for 7 more seconds.
that is so accurate and actually how we shop now. So I like that. I'm going to borrow the window shopping phrase. But I think the lack of attention span has almost been an opportunity for us to self reflect. What am I doing with my time? Is this something valuable for myself? Is this something valuable
Mhm.
for my community? And where can I be nostalgic for things that I might not even remember in my generation that might help me break free of that? So, great
Mm.
examples of this. First of all, 75% of our generation genuinely believes we can and will change the world for the better, which is crazy to me because we're
Mm.
constantly being told this is the end of humanity and this is the end times and we all need to be prepared for this horrible destruction of our country. But we're embracing the opportunity to take it in a different direction. And I think a lot of that has to do with our embrace of nostalgia for a time that we weren't around for or we don't remember. Like you mentioned having a typewriter. That's actually not that weird. Like almost all of my friends have vinyl record players in their house and prefer listening to music on
Or maybe
vinyl.
maybe we're just the weird ones.
Maybe,
Maybe we're
maybe
just
we're the weird ones. I don't know. But I mean, think about the TV shows even that Gen Z loves to
Yeah.
binge watch. We go back and we watch Friends for the millionth time instead of any stupid crap that Netflix or HBO is putting out today because they're just not as good. Or The Office or Parks and Rec. And there's this concept of authentic joy and an opportunity to just live your life where not everything had to be about negativity, about outrage, about partisan politics, about trying to bring more divisiveness into our culture. And I think that's why we love the 1990s. We brought back 1990s fashion, we listened to 1990s music. All of the TV shows we love to binge watch are all centered around New York in the 90s because it was this archetype of what could be possible in the most progressive
Mm.
society that we could create. And we've de-raveled so much from that in the next several decades
Mm.
into the 2020s. But I think it gives us a lot of hope for where we could go moving forward.
How do you balance nostalgia with the fact that we should be forward looking and building something innovative and new? How do you balance the
Hmm.
pull of nostalgia with the push of the future?
I don't think you can have one without the other and live in a responsible society, to be honest. And I think about this as a scientist more than anything. We've spent a lot of time on my live stream, kind of inexplicably, talking about bioethics lately, which is
Mm.
funny because I loved bioethics when I was studying it in school. You know, from the last time I was on the pod, I was a pre med student in college. My degree's in biomedical sciences. Never thought I would be a content creator, but life has other plans. And I remember loving these conversations about really complicated ethical questions with bioengineering and what could be possible in pharmaceutical development way back when I was a student. And we've seen that exponentially grow in the last 5 years, even since the dawn of COVID there at the end of 2019. And so we talk about things like there's a company in San Francisco growing human embryos
Mhm.
entirely from stem cells right now. And that's asinine and so crazy and innovative that we can even do that in society. But just because we can, should we? Or we talk about lab grown meat and how everybody's concerned about the environmental implications of the meat industry and agriculture, even though lab grown meat is far worse for the environment and carbon emissions than actual agriculture. So I hope that people do their research about this. But everybody wants to ask, just because we can, should we? And I think the same can be said about any political or cultural issue when we look at this balance with nostalgia and progress. Nostalgia keeps us grounded in the values that have made humanity strong in our great chapters of
Mhm.
history. progress allows us to bring things forward into new technologies and new innovation and a new era, because the truth is we do live in a new era in the 2020s. And I think a lot of people, particularly those in politics who have been there longer than twice the time we've been alive, need a reminder that we're in a new era. But the nostalgia keeps it balanced to better times when progress wasn't necessarily the number one virtue in society the way that I think it often is today. We progress or we die is kind of the motto of everything, from business to politics to everything. Even if the system isn't broken, we still find a need to fix it. But nostalgia reminds us of the times where we were united, where we could think about ethics and responsibility and morality in society. So I think both have to go hand in hand.
How do you respond to the person that's listening right now and is critical of this notion of nostalgia? Because when they hear you and I talk about this time that was better, that was more exciting, that might have been more unified, that they would make the claim that in fact folks from their community might have felt incredibly distanced from. How do you respond to the critique of a nostalgia of looking backwards?
Absolutely valid critique. And I think this is where there's a magical word that we've erased from our vocabulary in the 2020s for whatever reason, called nuance, that matters. And I think it does really make a difference.
That's the tagline of the show, by the way. That's the tagline of the show. It's like, how do you build nuance and fight outrage? Keep
exactly
going.
There are answers of it depends. My parents are both lawyers, and I'll never forget growing up, I did competitive speech and debate in high school. I was like really nerdy.
Same.
It was great.
That's how, you can tell the weird ones apart.
Oh yeah, when you
used
to dress up in suits every Saturday, life was good. What were your events, out of curiosity?
Oh, varsity policy. So speed talking like a crazy person. In fact, if you're listening to this right now, I don't know what type of debate you did, but it's hard for me to be here so incredibly curious about what you have to say when in that debate format, you have to know everything about everything.
Oh yeah.
Spurt the words out. Like in a minute, 300 words. It's quite insane. If anybody wants to see college students or high school students looking like they have a stroke while they're delivering a master's thesis about something they know, go check out Varsity Policy Debate on YouTube.
My favorite event, and the one I went to Nats for a couple of times, was congressional debate. I loved congressional debate, largely because it was about building consensus, actually, which is fascinating that this is what I do now for a living. But my backup was extemporaneous speech, which actually used to give me a stroke all the time. Literally, you go into a room, you draw 3 tiny pieces of paper out of an envelope, and you pick one that you think you might have the most research on that you didn't know you were going to get. They just surprise you that day, but you read the news every day, and you have 30 minutes to write a 7-minute extemporaneous speech with sources and evidence.
They're like, whip it out right now.
It's like, like, how do I even do that? At Nats, when I made my way out of congressional debate, I think I didn't qualify after semifinals. And so I went into the sad events for the people who aren't actually going to place in anything. And there was an extemp section for me. And I'll never forget, I was asked about the impact of Cambodian rice production on global GDP. And I looked at this envelope and just immediately started crying. So good time. But we
in some ways, though, I bet that like the ability to find a topic that is weird out of nowhere that you've never seen before and come up with your commentary on it is basically your job now in a nutshell, and then trying to build consensus on it. And so like when I was really deeply reading the context of your book, I was looking to the summaries, and for the record, I always tell people if I have or have not read the book. I have not read the book because apparently I'm not special enough to actually read the book.
No, you're getting one. I just got my copies in the mail yesterday. They were late from the printers, so that's why. Yeah.
But I read all of the context around it and the media around it, and it says in the title, "Save America." And you talk about building consensus, and we talk about, this push and pull between nostalgia and progress. Can you, from your standpoint, explain what it means to save America? Because I wonder if everybody believes the same thing when they hear saving America.
That's, also a great conversation for nuance right there, I think, because really the answer to everything is it depends. Oh, I was saying that about my parents. My parents are both lawyers. So when I was doing competitive speech and debate, I would always ask them, okay, well, what's like the legal argument for something like this? And their answer, they'd always chuckle and say, it depends, is the answer to any legal question. And I think the same thing can be said for so many of the cultural and political issues we're dealing with. Of course, there's chapters of American history that we all feel nostalgic for, but some people would disagree with that, and that's okay. There are times where we think everything was so unified and harmonious and perfect, and it really wasn't. It just seems like that from our vantage point today, and we long for something like that because we are so divided, and that's okay too. So I think that nuance really matters. But when we talk about America and our founding principles as a country, this idea where anyone, everyone, no matter what you look like, no matter where you came from, no matter what language you spoke, or your level of education, or your socioeconomic status, or your religion, where you could come to a place and you had inalienable endowed rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's really what this entire crazy experiment called America boils down to. And have we had incredibly dark chapters of our history? Yes. Have there been bad people involved in the leadership of that process? Yes, but the central, simple idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and e pluribus unum, out of many one, that nobody had the opportunity to be declined from this beautiful experiment that we all get to participate in every day. That's worth fighting for, and it's worth trying to preserve. And we always like to talk about in politics, America is never more than one generation away from extinction, and freedom and liberty is. Ronald Reagan said that when he was president. But I think we're seeing that accelerated in real time in the 2020s to a point that people are rightfully concerned those founding ideas might not exist 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And all the stupid, trivial things that we argue about every day that seem so important in the moment will kind of cease to exist as debates or conversations or opportunities for nuance because that solid foundation will disappear. So when we talk about Gen Z saving America, I think it really starts with our generation embracing a call to leadership and standing up and fighting not just for ourselves to have a voice at the table, but everybody else who comes after us too. And B, kind of returning to those foundational principles again, understanding that, sure, we can argue all day, every day about the stupid thing that this celebrity or podcast host said on Twitter. And there's plenty to argue about with what is said on Twitter all day, every day. Sure, we can disagree on this bill in Congress or what the president said at the State of the Union. And those things are worthy causes to give some of our attention to. But the hills to die on of freedom of expression, our freedom to challenge ourselves and challenge our leaders with their perspectives, with rightful criticism when they need it every once in a while, to freely practice our religions, to freely assemble with one another, to even sit down and have conversations like this is under threat, especially in the digital age, to a point that people, I think, don't really know how to wrap their heads around quite yet. But I always like to say that if anybody's going to save the train from going off the cliff, it is going to be young people. And that's been true since long before America was even formally a country. In fact, on July 4th, 1776, the founding fathers were not these horribly ancient, wrinkled old men that I think everybody wants us to believe that they are. I don't know if I said this last time on your podcast, but I always love asking the high schoolers and college students about the old white men.
Do it again.
They always say the same thing.
Round two. Give us
round two. But on July 4th, 1776, these people that were fighting for freedom, were fighting for life, were fighting for liberty, for people who came after them, even if they laid their own life down in the process, they were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. When we look at their actual ages, it's just fascinating to me. James Monroe was 18, Aaron Burr was 20, Alexander Hamilton was only 21, Betsy Ross was 24, James Madison was 25. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was only 33 years old, which I know to many Gen Zers sounds ancient, but you hit 26 and you're like, oh God, that is like right around the corner. He was only 33 on July 4th, 1776. And they were building this concept of a foundation, not just for their country and politics, but for a society that would allow for thriving new ideas, challenging debate, freedom to criticize people in power, freedom to thrive for yourself as an individual, for your family, for your community and country at large, that they knew would outlive them and hopefully be preserved for generations to come. And with everything, Gen Z gets a bad rap for. I think if you really look at our cultural trends, and you remove the partisan labels and you remove who's the president and who has the best polling and all of that yada yada nonsense noise that really doesn't contribute anything meaningful, that's what we're fighting for. Again, on the left and the right, we're taking to the streets to protest for things. We're running for office ourselves. We're embracing digital advocacy, whatever we can do to bring that foundation back to the forefront. We are.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when you describe the founding ideals, and we'd actually talked about this on episode 4, we'd actually titled that episode America the Most Ambitious Experiment. The reason why we use the word ambitious, not greatest, not worse, is because I think there's nuance. And with ambition, you're trying to strive for something amazing, and likely you are to fall short, but then you keep building. And I think
Absolutely.
most people, if you ask them, Isabel, like, when you say saving America, what that means is restoring the founding ideals. I think most people would say yes, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, being able to practice and practice the faith that we all believe in, 100%. And yet, let's say I'm somebody that classifies myself as a liberal, and I'm reading the summary of your book, and I see saying restoring conservative values. If I'm a liberal, how would you explain to me what you mean by conservative values?
Yeah.
And importantly, how do you think I should wrestle in my mind with that immediate disconnect that happens between the unifying vision you're selling and then what might seem like a different how?
It's silly that you say that, and I actually love that you used the word liberal right there because I think the same thing happens on the political right. As soon as you use the word liberal, even if it's not in the context of
Yep.
Republican or Democrat, people go, and you're not really thinking of classical liberalism or even
Hmm.
liberalism as an ideology. You start thinking of leftism and you immediately tie your brain to that. So I said earlier in our conversation, when I say the word conservative, forget about Republican or capital C conservative or a red hat, because that's not really what I'm talking about. Conservative meaning nostalgic, meaning things that have been tried and true human institutions and practices for thousands of years throughout human history, no matter what country or society you live in, no matter what language you spoke or who was in positions of power. I think it's really cool and telling that Gen Z kind of shrugs and says, ugh, shies away from that word conservative, but our actual actions are wildly, not politically, not partisan, but culturally conservative. There was a poll that just came out from a college campus, several college campuses a couple of weeks ago, that 93% of our generation still wants to get married, which is astounding if you think about the fact that America currently has the lowest marriage rate our country has ever seen
Hmm.
since we began recording
I
marriage
didn't know
rates in
that.
1867. And yet 93% of us still want to get married, which is always put down in the media and in pop culture as this archaic, outdated institution that humans don't really need today. If you look at dating apps, even before you start thinking about marriage, Gen Z, no matter where you fall politically, is rejecting dating apps en masse. People are freaking out about this from the corporate perspective over at Match Group and several other competing companies because 90% of Gen Zers surveyed by Pew Research say they've had horrible experiences on dating apps, and most are deleting them within the first month of downloading them now. We're moving out of really urban areas and we're flocking to more traditional homestead type communities. We're homeschooling our kids, those of us that are old enough to start having kids. And if you survey teenagers, they're saying, yeah, someday I don't want to send my kids to school because I'm in school right now and it sucks and I hate it and I feel like there's no opportunity for true education. So someday I plan on doing that. If you're Christian, there's a huge Christian revival happening in America today. In 2021, only less than 25% of Gen Zers in America said they remotely believed in a higher power. But by the end of 2023, over 1/3 of our generation said that they believed in God and were regularly attending church, which is just about the most traditionally, culturally
Mhm,
conservative thing you could
mhm.
do, at least in American history and through that perspective. So when we look at actions and lifestyles and putting your money where your mouth is, we are pretty conservative. Again, forget the red hat color and
Yep.
the political partisan affiliation with that word. And I think we don't realize that. We think that it's reinventing the wheel because we're rebelling against everybody that we see older than us that has rebelled against the people before them, but that cycle keeps
Mm.
continuing.
It's so interesting that you're extricating left from liberal and right from conservative. And I think that's essentially the spirit of the show, which is that if you live in a world in which you only think classically liberal ideas work or classically conservative ideas work, that's just not how humanity has functioned. There
Mhm.
are good things in both, and there's also bad things in both. The question is how you build the mosaic of ideas so that you actually get somewhere. And when you're extricating contemporary leftism from liberalism and extricating contemporary right wing rhetoric from conservative, my question then naturally becomes how do you do that at scale? Because I actually think that if you are able to extricate the political label and the left from the liberal and the right from the conservative, I think you can get somewhere really far, because then you don't have the immediate knee jerk of, ooh, she said conservative, that must mean she's like all for Trump all day, every day, or ooh, she said left, and that means that you're for Biden all day, every day, or liberal. I
Mhm.
mean, so how do you navigate that at scale? Because I think that that's a really worthy cause, and it's something that I bang my head against every day, and yet I'm on the look for people that have innovative ideas to push that.
I think our generation is bringing this to scale in really unexpected ways. It'll probably take a while to permeate the institutions of American politics and governance, at least in Washington, D.C., because those things move like a herd of turtles. We all watched the State of the Union last week, and it was wildly depressing seeing how long it took
You know,
everybody to
I
walk in
saw
the room.
somebody, Isabel, I saw somebody say that the State of the Union audience looked like an open casket convention. I forgot which show I
Literally,
saw that on, but
I saw
like,
somebody do a voiceover of it being the most expensive funeral home in America, and I thought that was great. That was very well done. But anyway, I digress. When you look at young Gen Zers, so I was born in 1997. I'll be 27 in May. I'm the very, very beginning of this crazy, dreaded Gen Z everybody likes to talk about. This goes down to kids about 12 or 13 years old today. After that comes Gen Alpha, and they are the children of millennials. And I always say they need our extra prayers because they're going to need our help in the crazy upside down world they're growing up in. But really, we're talking about mostly teenagers, mostly kids who are still figuring it out. They haven't yet graduated from high school. They haven't yet registered to vote. And when they start to take that process of newly registered Gen Z voters, 52% of them are registering as independent with a capital I, as saying, I do not just get to blindly pledge my allegiance to a party because that's who my parents supported, or I liked that particular politician, or I generally live in a pretty blue or red community.
mm,
I am going to think for myself, and I'm going to challenge this idea to extricate conservative from right and liberal from left to get the best, as you said, I loved how you said this, mosaic of ideas for the people and the policies that I want to support. Really great example
mm.
of how that's manifesting on a singular policy issue, I think, for Gen Z is the environment. We were just talking before we started recording that a couple of days ago, I was in Los Angeles, California, with our awesome friends over at the American Conservation Coalition, which is really the first ever right of center policy organization for the environment. And they're specifically tailored towards working with youth, which I think is amazing. But they put together this event that they co-hosted with people on the left and organizations on the left who cared about environmental issues and wanted to create more public policy discourse on this issue. The Arnold Schwarzenegger Foundation helped to put it on in California. The former governor was there, which was very cool. And he obviously has not made a lot of friends as an individual who has been pretty conservative Republican, but also very staunchly pro-environment. And that's confused a lot of people for a long time. But that's exactly what we're seeing at a generational level and normalizing this on this one issue for Gen Z in politics. We are the most likely generation to say that there are massive environmental issues in our time that need immediate addressing. We want to take proactive steps from a policy perspective and from an innovation and business and personal responsibility perspective too. And for us, it's really not a conservative right or liberal left, red or blue issue to care about the environment, to be green, which I find fascinating because I'm a great example of that. It is no secret that I am a pretty darn conservative with a capital C Catholic girl who votes pretty red, generally speaking, although I feel very disenfranchised by the Republican Party. Long dissertation conversation for a different time.
And I will
But
say that I was at a Roman Catholic wedding 2 weeks ago, and I was sitting at a table of your Catholic conservative peers, and I would just say that we had some of the most interesting conversations ever. And I
yeah,
and I'm somebody that is always open to those dialogues and those conversations. And I was always shocked by, man, even somebody doing this work for a living, I'm prejudiced. And
hmm.
so I think you're absolutely right. But keep going. Keep
No, I
going.
love that actually, because you'd be hard pressed to find anyone more interested in debate and playing devil's advocate than a bunch of Catholics at a wedding. We love talking about theology and
Especially in Latin,
politics.
when the mass is in Latin.
Oh, I
So that's
love
really
that.
great.
That's like very, very traditional.
Oh
Wow,
yeah.
I love that. So it's no surprise that that's where I'm coming from. But I grew up in a small mountain community 30 minutes west of Denver in Colorado, where I spent way more time outside with dirt and snow all over my face than I ever wanted to be inside at school. My favorite things to do in the summer at summer camp were to go on 2-week backpacking trips where you don't shower and you have to hang the bear bag and make all of your own food and carry it on your back. My sisters and I competed every summer to see who could get the best Chaco tan of your Chaco sandals from hiking outside and whitewater rafting. I mean, that was my entire childhood. And I was always raised with this idea from my parents, from my community, even from more conservative relationships that I had, that caring for the environment is our responsibility, whether that's myself as an individual picking up trash on the trail when I'm going for a hike, or at the community level, volunteering for trail maintenance issues or trying to raise money for conservation causes, or even at the national level with our national park system and public lands and what that's supposed to look like with reasonable policy moving forward. I think for millennials, you hear that and you think conservative environmentalist. Yeah, okay, when pigs fly. But for Gen Z, everyone says, yeah, me too. No problems there. There is no partisan divide there whatsoever. And so I'm hopeful that that issue can create opportunities for nuance, for separating those ideas from the immediate backlash of, I can't associate with anything that I don't agree with. Maybe there is a middle ground and an opportunity to have dialogue like at this event that I just had, where we all ended up saying the exact same thing, not just about the environment, by the way, but about other issues too. Even though when we sat down first thing in the morning with our coffee, we all were a little nervous to see how the conversation would go. It ended up being an incredibly valuable experience.
And we all just glazed over the fact that Arnold was there when you said
yeah,
the horrible
also
governor.
so cool.
You mean Arnold, and you mentioned the conservative environmentalists. You know, we had our mutual friend Danny Butcher on for one of the podcasts talk about ACC, and our mutual friend Benji is writing a book called The Conservative Environmentalist, and he'll actually come on soon to talk about that. And I think the last 5 minutes, I think, articulate that even the folks that might disagree with what you have to say would hopefully, I think, agree with the temperament that you and I are bringing to this conversation, which is how do we extricate the left and the right from liberal, conservative, and actually have the real conversation? And yes, we can disagree, but how do you get somewhere with that disagreement? Last question I've got. I was just thinking about this. I was like, should I ask the clickbaity question of Biden versus Trump, or should I actually ask a question I'm interested in asking? So I'm going to ask the question that I'm interested in asking, which is that what is your strongest argument to somebody that might disagree with what you have to say on face to actually pick up your book and read it?
I've been really fortunate, even since college, when I really started in the world of activism, far before I was ever a content creator, to have very fascinating dialogue. And I don't want to use the word debate because it's never really been angry, but just great conversation with people who fundamentally disagree with me on everything. And some of those people have become my best friends. Most of my extended family fundamentally disagrees with me on everything. But I try really hard in everything that I post, in what I write about, in the speeches that I give, to bring things back to this common shared foundation of humanity that we're all living through. Because the truth is, what we're talking about when we talk about gender ideology and abortion and the really controversial issues of our time, where we are so encouraged to immediately run away at breakneck speed from anybody who disagrees with us, because all of a sudden we're in an unsafe environment, and that's not an okay place for us to be. When we're talking about these things, even though we yell and scream at each other and we post the clickbait content and it's own the libs and own the MAGA conservatives all over Twitter. I hate Twitter. God, it is literally where dreams go to die. I'm convinced of that. We're really talking about wanting to support humanity and wanting to create a better world that's more compassionate, that's creating more opportunities for people, that's trying to bridge the divide that everybody in positions of power is successfully getting us to buy into right now. And I love that our generation is rejecting that. We're curious. We're very intellectually independent and headstrong. And we're seeing this renaissance of curiosity that I never anticipated before I started doing the research for this book. And now I see it with a greater fervor every single day when I speak on campus, or I talk to other Gen Zers on the internet, or I go speak to a conference or an organization. If you're at all curious about A, challenging your own perspective, B, learning what other people might have to say and think, even if you think you might genuinely agree with me on everything, I can promise you, you don't, and you should pick up this book as proof of that. But more importantly, how to let all of that go and learn from someone else and bridge that divide of humanity that the people older than us in power have been pushing for so long. This book is for you.
A renaissance of curiosity, bridging the divide, not a paid ad for Bridge USA, but I'll take it. I would just say that I really appreciate, the way that you approach these conversations. I can tell the effort you put in to speak to different audiences to try and get them to see where you're coming from. And I think that that's something that is hard to do, and also something we don't incentivize, because I'm sure when you go to another audience, you get vilified for it, and yet you're standing for your thought process and your ideas. And on March, what is it, 19th?
19th. Yep.
Z Day.
I'm going to steal that, by the way. My publisher is going to love that.
You're stealing a lot of things from me. This is something that I have to start getting used to. More
you got to trademark your good phrases, okay?
Yeah, it's just the boomer in me. But the book, The End of the Alphabet, How Gen Z Can Save America. I mean, I'm very curious to see, Isabel, how folks react to it, how they respond to it, because I know that you've put your heart and soul into it. And at the end of the day, what more can you ask for? So thanks for coming on The Hopeful Majority.
Thank you for having me. And just as one last message of encouragement for everybody, try today to do something way outside of your comfort zone and follow somebody that their first video you see, you think, oh my gosh, I would have nothing in common with this person. And don't hit unfollow for the next couple of months. You might be shocked to see what happens.
There's your call to action. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Well, thank you to listening. Thank you to Isabel for joining. Thank you for all the hard work that you put into this. And remember, if you're listening to the show and you did not agree with everything that Isabel had to say, great. Leave a response in the comments. Leave a review. Like, subscribe. If you're on Spotify, Apple, remember that we're trying to grow this together and we need all of us. And if you agreed with things on the show, also leave a comment, because we need to build this hopeful majority together. As Isabel said, nuance is important. As Isabel talked about how we can actually take out the left from the liberal, how we can take out the right from the conservative, so that we can have a real discussion of ideas. That's ultimately what this is all about. So thank you for joining the show, and I'll see you next week.